In this lesson, we'll look at the basic structure of research articles. And there are two basic structures that are very common in science and engineering, respectively. Science, including both social science and natural science, usually uses what's called IMRD. Engineering uses a similar structure, which I've called IPTC. And then you have review articles, which have a very different structure. We'll talk briefly about each of those. Let's begin with IMRD.
You look at IMRD, that's a very familiar structure in social science, at least. Introduction, you lay out the foundation. You tell people what you have found out, which is not addressed in your research. That's a general introduction. The goal is to identify why your current research is important. Then you begin by telling about how I am going to address these research questions by using what kind of methods. And the method also has various sections. For example, the research site, the participants, and the research methods, the procedures, the tools you're going to use, and so on. So it's very rigorous to provide a foundation for people to recognize, yes, you are not just joking, you are not just fooling me around, you are providing some rigorous research that's worth reading. And then in the results, you address your research questions by providing, voila, these are the findings. The findings cannot be too boring, so you have to present them systematically by providing different sections. And also in each section, you will have tables and figures and sometimes transcripts of interviews systematically presented to the audience so they can read, catch the information very quickly, and with a clear, systematic description in paragraphs, people can understand what exactly the findings are. But that's not the end, because after you present your results, you have to tell the readers what these mean. Now, why you have certain findings like this. That's the so-called discussion. And the discussion sometimes also contains the conclusion.
So these headers tend to be fairly fixed in some journals, where you have introduction, methods, results, discussion. But there are others that have a lot more variation. And as you say, in subsections, there are certainly differences. What I've seen in social sciences is if they have 3 research questions, they'll often have 3 sections in the results that will match those 3 research questions and discuss each of them in order, so that it's a clear correspondence between the questions and the results.
And in fact, we also prefer to have a conclusion. In social science, we want to put in the conclusion. First, we summarize what's written there, but we want to talk about limitation of our study because we want to be humble, to show people, we are not perfect. So don't criticize me too easily. And also want to provide directions for future research. And especially in education, it's important to talk about pedagogical implications.
Right. So these are different variations on IMRD that sometimes after the introduction, before the methods, you'll have a separate section on literature review or theoretical framework. Sometimes you have a combined results and discussion with a separate conclusion. Sometimes you have things, as you said, like pedagogical implications or something else. So the names may not be fixed, but the basic 4 sections are quite well recognized and easily recognized in most social science and science journals.
So it's important to know the macro structure to increase efficiency so that in a 25-page research paper, you can identify where I can find the precious stone.
So in this case, the introduction doesn't have a name. It just sort of starts right after the title without a section name. And that is common in some journals. And then it has materials and methods. And again, many different subsections for all the different materials and methods that they're going to use. And then the results matches those materials and methods. You have the physical measurements, the antioxidant systems, and the isoprostanes, all of which are mentioned specifically in the materials and methods, and then a general discussion at the end. So here you can see that the 4 sections are clearly marked, and there are no additional sections, but this is just the sort of basic structure of IMRD. And then it's also important to note that the abstract, supplemental material, acknowledgements, references, none of those are considered part of the article itself. And that's why if there are section numbers, those will not be given section numbers. And in some fields, you also have footnotes. Now, again, those are much more common in social science, but very rare in science and engineering.
In a footnote, we are actually trying to tell other expert readers that we are really familiar with a lot of the details of this research, but we don't want to burden the common readers about all the minor details. So we want to put them there in order to show I am knowledgeable, I know what's going on, but it's too detailed. So I put it in a footnote.
Now, on the other hand, in engineering, there's a very different structure. It has a lot of similarities, but you don't have particularly the methods and results and discussion. You have an introduction, and the introduction is very similar to IMRD. You talk about the motivation, the limitations of past work, and the research goal. But then you have one or more sections that talk about the process of developing whatever that new design is, whatever the new solution is to this problem. And then you have testing, and the testing often has a simulation component or physical component or both in the testing. And then the conclusion is always a separate section in engineering. Now again, there are some variations on this. You may have a related work section after the introduction. The related work is very similar to the literature review, but a different name, where it continues with a more in-depth discussion of previous literature. You may also have preliminaries or background, which talk about the theoretical framework or the mathematical background of the work.
In the IPTC framework, would you say that P, the process section, is very similar to method?
It's very similar, but the difference is that method section is often relatively short because similar methods have been used before. Whereas in engineering, the process division may be half the article, because that's the main contribution of the article is the development of this new design. And so that's the main difference. Also, the method section in a science paper will usually include something about statistics. How did we test the significance of these results? But that's very rare in engineering. And usually anything that talks about the testing is combined with the results. So you have, we did this test, these are the results, this is what it means. And that will all be in one paragraph. And it just keeps repeating this over and over again, cyclically, through different types of tests that are done, as opposed to summarizing all the tests first and then all the results.
In other words, engineering has a different culture.
Yes.
They have their own way of doing things.
Right. So again, here is an engineering article. The first introduction is very clear. The second, talking about the receiver architecture, that's actually related work. That's past work that's describing sort of the framework on which we're building this. And then the third section about design talks about the process of designing different parts of this system. And then in the fourth section and the fifth section, it talks about first the computer simulation and then measurements on a prototype of the design. And then you have a conclusion. And again, in engineering, you almost always have an introduction and conclusion, but then the intervening sections are based on the titles of the sections are based on the individual research rather than standard headings that you have in science or social science.
So it seems to me, in reading engineering article, I have to pay attention to the P, the process section, very carefully. But in social sciences, we pay attention to the R, the results and discussion.
Exactly. Now again, there are other types of articles. Secondary research, as we mentioned, will often talk about sources of data rather than methods. Conference papers, letters will often have a very, very short section about some parts. We'll talk more about that in the final video in this unit. Now again, review articles have a very different structure because they have a different purpose. And they're much more varied because the types of reviews that you can do are quite varied. Usually they begin with an introduction, which talks again about the motivation. Why do we want to do this? But then it talks about the limitations of the review. We're reviewing comprehensively or only within certain years or within a certain small subset of the available literature. It can be chronological or thematic. There are different ways of organizing the material. Then they'll often give sort of general background, the things that everybody accepts. And then the main part of the review, which the main part in terms of the amount of material and the importance, is comparing different methods, comparing different approaches, comparing different papers, evaluating, discussing. And then again, it will conclude with conclusion and future directions.
So it seems to me, even though review articles are considered secondary research, they are very difficult to write. If you are not an expert in your field, you are in no position to attempt something like this.
Well, yes, again, in social science, that's true. They're almost always written by experts in the field. But in engineering, a professor will often assign a graduate student to write a review article on what's been done in the past 5 years in a particular field as a way of helping them to find a gap, to find something to work on. So again, it's a very different culture in different fields. And that means that review articles are more important in some fields than they are in others.
We can also assign our students to write a review article based on what they have found. But that's very much like a big section of literature review of primary research.
Right. And I've even seen a few articles that have like a review and then a short research. So again, there are many variations on this, but this will give you a general idea of where to start. So again, here's an example of a research article, and it begins with an introduction. Then it talks about the background, the previous work on fatty acids and cardiovascular risk. And then the main part of this paper looks at 4 different recent studies. It's not a comprehensive review, but it's looking at a comparison of these 4 studies and what they found. And then there's a discussion that tries to tie all of this information together into something that makes sense and gives future directions in the conclusion. So again, before you read any article, identify the type of article, look at the section headings, determine what you're likely to find where, and this will help you to know where to look for things. And in the last video in this unit, we'll talk more specifically about the types of things that are likely to be found in each section.
So they are very much like signposts. They show you what's next, so you can get to your destination.